And yeah, hopefully you can see this. I'm not going to do any fancy presentation side of this, but the goal here is to like legitimately have some very oversimplified diagrams of our gas system, our electric system where I'm starting, our gas system, and then our bills. The idea being here, to the idea of what I want to put out there is to say, there's a basic understanding of like the physics of this, of electricity is generated one place and has to go somewhere else. Or gas is, is extracted one place, refined one place, and is supposed to get to a final place. Like that's the whole vision behind how the systems are supposed to work. And then we have bills, which are about trying to exchanging the value that's supposed to be in there or that this system represents. And to remind people that the physics of a system and the market structures of the system of how we've been able to figure out how to pay for it are related, but like stepchildren, if you will, or shadows of each other. And trying to overlay a physics system on a billing system is like they are, once again, they're related and they're connected, but they're not the same. And they don't necessarily show up in the same ways. Um, so just as a start is like once again, oversimplified like graphics that I pulled off of a quick Google search was my criteria for this. Traditionally, how we understand our grid to work on the electric side is there's a generation, transmission from the generators to the local distributors, and then it goes through the distributor substations and then out to the final end users. Traditionally, that's how it works. It goes from point A to point C, I guess, and a little transmission being B in the middle. And historically, that's generally what we had. And now a simplified picture of more of what's being developed and more of what we have now is there's still large scale generation, there's still large scale large scale transmission, but now the distribution and consumption side of this is a lot more complicated. Because now there's generation also happening here on the distribution portion of this. And so it takes things kind of in a different way. And if you see here, like distributed generation, there's the rooftop side of it. There's like the small commercial side, not commercial, the small installations. But then there's the larger ones that are connected to the distribution system instead of the transmission system. So it's kind of, it is evolving from one system to another system, is the vision of where we're at. Now, how good are we at this is a whole different question. Are we doing it well? Is the type of thing about what should we be advocating for and how should it occur? But I think that there's a general understanding like this is the transition that's happening. And if you look over here on this side, I have no idea if you can see my cursor on this, so I will use my
We
word
can.
instead. Okay.
We can.
On the distribution side, this control center here, this is generally what you would think of as the as utilities central brain, if you will, about how to understand the information that's being generated on the system and then driving its decision making in both evaluating what's happening on the distribution system and then managing it to the degree that they have the ability to manage this. Now, their ability to manage this is also a changing variable from a time when they could see what's going on like a monthly basis based off of meter reads to as they are installing more advanced meters, they have more real-time vision of what is the load, where is generation happening. And conceivably, there will be a time in the future where they can exercise a level of control over that. The idea being is that if the utility can control it, maybe they don't have to build out as much stuff if they can just control the flow of energy. Now, there's also the question about whether they would do that if they make all their money off of building stuff. Why would they ever have a system designed to not build more stuff? Reasonable questions, but the goal here is not to answer those questions. The goal here is to kind of lay out what are some of the factors that are in play here. Yeah, so the idea here then is, as you see with the control center, is both taking in the information from the community as well as sending information back out to route energy accordingly, increase storage, try to reduce demand. What are all the levers of intervention that a distribution utility has in both its engagement with customers as well as physical hardware, as well as software control over generation and distribution of energy. So those are the kind of the two, and once again, oversimplified. There's so many nuances in this that we could spend hours going at, but the idea of like a traditional going in one direction system to now a mostly going in one direction, but at the end you also have a whole lot of back and forth that utilities have to deal with. Now, I also just put this out there of so the next piece I'm going to go into is like, what does this look like on a bill? So we can see. But the first thing I always want to put out there is to remind everybody, and as simplistic as it seems, is that the bill is created of two main components. There's the supply side, paying for the extra energy we use, and the delivery side of paying for that energy to get from point A to us, wherever point A might be. Point A could be a generator, it could be a generator way at the far end of the grid and putting energy on, or it could be so like covering transmission charges for that, or it could be the distributed generation that's down the road and making sure that that energy can get out of somebody else's rooftop solar back onto the grid into me when I don't have rooftop solar and I'm flipping on my lights. So the delivery is both transmission side as well as on the distribution side. The whole idea of the transmission is built into that delivery portion of the bill. And once again, if anybody has questions or wants to stop for clarifications, just pop up or say something, or a digital hand of any sort, just to make sure I see what's going on. All right, so I did a little I did a screenshot of my bill a few months ago, and I put it on here. So I tried to get rid of the meter number and account number so you can't steal my identity, but really, it wouldn't be hard to. My information's out there on the dark web everywhere, just like everybody else's. So I don't even know why we do this, but either way, Rhode Island Energy has put out, like they have revised their bills. So these are different than we might have been familiar with for a fair number of years. Um, and so they have gone to the side of like really divvying up the supply side and the delivery side of the bill. And you can see my absurd usage levels here and the amount of energy that we use in our home, and please judge me accordingly for that. I do like how some of the changes that they've made about electricity usage and temperature and monthly cost comparison. I'm still figuring out if it's useful or not since I keep my own utility bill tracker spreadsheets because I'm a total nerd and way too obsessed about this. So trying to see if they provide any information that I also find useful. But this broad presentation is then on the second, can you get that? There you go. On the second page, you get a lot more detail. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. All right, so what I'm going to try to do in this is connect what's here on the detailed side of the bill with what we described before in the system. And shout out to Tina. Yes, I'm still a Green Energy Consumers Alliance purchaser of 100% wind credits, even though as the RES keeps going up, there are times when my partner in life here goes, why are we buying all these RECs again? This doesn't seem to make any more sense. What are we at 140%, 140% RECs now? But that's a whole different question. But on my supply side, we have two pieces here of the actual energy that is delivered by Rhode Island Energy. I'm on last resort service because that's pretty much the only offer here in North Smithfield. And then this is a Green Up program that the Green Energy Consumers Alliance offers, where you can voluntarily buy additional RECs to be able to make the claim that I'm using 100% renewable energy as I turn on my heat pumps and charge my electric vehicle. I don't want to say I'm using a whole lot more coal because of it, or oil generation for it. So on the supply side of this, you can see, where is it here? Okay, kilowatt hours used. So this is the big number. I mean, this is the number that every month the goal is to be able to calculate how many kilowatt hours did you use. And that becomes the basis of the supply side. Every 6 months, last resort service is altered to set a new supply number, and that's this one down here. I don't need to do that. Careful. This 16 cents, the 16.387 cents was that was the supply cost this spring before we moved over to the summer rates. And this one, I believe we're about 14.4 or 14.7 going into this winter. I just saw a bill from earlier where that number is. So the basics of my supply is going to be the amount I use, number of kilowatt hours, times the 6-month rate that they charge. And then in my situation, we also add on the additional RECs that we chose to purchase. So to make sure that I have 100% RECs for the usage that I have. Excuse me. So the supply side is pretty simple. If you are in a renewable energy generation program, you have rooftop solar of some sort, how this looks on your bill is going to be a little bit different depending on whether you're a net metering customer or a renewable energy growth customer. Just to oversimplify this, if you're a net metering customer, what you'll see on here is a net number. You'll see if for my 775, if I've generated 600 and used that on site, or if I get credit for generating 600, even if I'm putting it back out onto the grid, what they will charge me for is the net of what I have. So if I generated 600, this kilowatt hour usage was say 175. Now that 600 kilowatts that I might have generated and not reflected on my bill, this is something that has come up on a regular, especially in the metering hearings that have happened. And I've heard it referred to as ghost load, as in this is capacity that conceivably the grid needs to be prepared to manage if for some reason my solar panels don't work. They just stop working today, or it's really cloudy, or whatever those reasons are. Those 600 kilowatt hours that I used over the course of the month is conceivably load that the utility needs to be prepared to deliver. Now, that's the way that they present it. Now, they don't necessarily know what it is because they only read the net number on our bill. So they don't know necessarily how much I generated. If I had an app on my phone where, like, I used Newport Solar the last time I had a house with solar panels on it, and I had an app I could use where I could track my generation, how much I generated, how much I exported, and then how much I imported. But that's more information than the utility necessarily had because they kind of came around and they do the billing of it. And so their goal was to figure out those net pieces, that net number, and to put it on our bill. Everything else beyond that is kind of an opaque thing. They know it's there, they have a sense of what it is, but it's not something they necessarily were tracking and measuring on a day-to-day, 15-minute by 15-minute interval, which is the way they're going to go with the new advanced meters. So they'll have more insight into what is that ghost load, what's the risk profile of it, and they might change the type of investment decisions they make. But at this point, that's all hypothetical because they're not seeing it. The alternative would be if I was a renewable energy growth customer, I would have 2 meters on my house, 1 meter for everything coming in and another meter for everything going out, which means they see it. There's no ghost side of this. They see exactly what's coming in, exactly what's going out. And it allows them to make planning decisions accordingly based off of what they know that ghost load to be, because it's not the same, not a ghost to them. It is, in fact, very visible. So I just want to put that out there as like the way in which we do renewable energy generation. How it shows up on our bill versus what the utilities see is actually a shifting thing. And having sat through the hearings on the installation of the meters and how the meter data is going to be used, I don't know how this is going to be resolved, but it came up last week in a technical session that very soon the utility customer is on a application that the utility has given us and installed on our meters will have more information on our billing and usage than a customer service representative who's trying to answer our questions if we have issues with the billing system. So we are barreling towards a pretty serious conflict here. For example, if I am concerned, like if I look at this, they're going to have this app called Sense on it, where over time, it's got a machine learning algorithm, and it will learn the different. I hope I'm not going way into the weeds on here, but the load that's drawn through your meter based off of the type of machine that's using it. So whether it's a refrigerator or a TV or an EV charger, the way that it draws load looks different. It's got a different waveform as they describe it. And what the application on the meter is going to do is disaggregate the waveforms so that it will be able to identify like, hey, you have a dehumidifier and it's pulling this much energy and it turns on these times and turns off those times. Here's when your heat pumps are running and how much energy they specifically are using. Here's when your different appliances are running and how much energy they're using. So we'll have an application that gives us that to not a perfect degree of accuracy because once again, it's machine learning over waveforms. Like there will be errors in this. So Kevin and I have had this conversation of like, it's probably not billing quality data, but it sure is informative data that I will have. And if I go, why did I get a bill this high? If I look up the total of my energy usage, that's not how much energy I'm using. Can you resolve this for me? And you would call a customer service representative, and they will have no insight into what's on that app. They won't see it. They won't know it. They will have no visibility into it. And so even if you elevate your billing concern to, say, the division and say, I have a billing issue that I have to resolve, what does the hearing officer have? What do they get access to? And am I able to justify my concerns that are here? So it's just an interesting question, and I raised this because it came up last week of like this differential access to data. And it's a unique position to be in where it's likely that customers are going to have more granular data than the utility customer service departments will. And we don't know how we're going to resolve that. But yeah, Kevin.
So Jamie, I think it's kind of telling that the company didn't have a good response to that quandary. When I think there actually is a good answer. It would have been pretty crazy if Sense built an app that would have given you, disaggregated loads that could sum to more than your meter was reading. And I think they were smart enough to avoid that trap. My understanding is that they start with that total meter reading. They disaggregate the loads. They can identify some of the loads, some of them they can't. But the sum of the loads that Sense is reporting is always equal to the total meter reading. So
I,
I don't think that they're actually going
I'd
to run
like to
into that.
think that that will be the case, but the one thing I've learned is that if we assume normal course and logic from what the utility is going to do, then we are unprepared when that is not actually what they deliver.
Oh, I'm not underestimating the ability of Rhode Island Energy to misinterpret the available data. I'm just saying that I think Sense is probably doing it right based on what I've been able to find out there on the web. So we'll
Yeah,
see.
Tina.
I'm curious, and maybe this means I am too willing to give away information to customer service representatives, but is there not a way, and it might just not work, but for like a Rhode Island Energy customer to call into customer service and say, like, my bill is mismatched with how much energy I used, could they not give like access to the Rhode Island Energy customer service representative to see their, okay.
No, we don't know yet.
Gotcha.
Because, yeah, when the issue was presented when the issue arose in the technical session, the company, Rhode Island Energy, said, huh, I don't know how we're going to address that.
Totally revealing. Yeah.
Totally, yeah. It's like we haven't even considered that possibility. Hence, they're looking like a duck, but furiously swimming underneath like a bunch of humans being myopic in their own particular ways. Yeah, Jeff.
Yeah, just
This is just the supply side I'm on. I haven't even gotten to the distribution cost yet, but go ahead.
right. So this Sense app comes with this. You can hook it to when you get a smart meter.
It will, the software will already be loaded on the smart meter, and then you get a mobile application to be able to access it.
Okay, and is everybody getting smart meters? Do we?
Unless you have,
Yes.
unless you've opted out. Yes, everyone will have it by the end of next year.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. So that was supply side, and then an interesting tangent. So if you look under here under delivery details, this is everything that ends up going onto the delivery side of the bill. And I'm realizing here that there's a line, if you look up your bill right now, and I just got my most recent bill, there's actually one line item on a bill now. It's not on a line item from our bill in the spring, and those are transition charges. So just imagine under here, there's another line between energy efficiency and transmission, there's a transition charge. But I'll go through, excuse me, sorry. Just have a cough. I'm trying to keep a cough drop going. But I'll go with it within each one of these line items here as best as I can. But these are things like, these are supposed to be all the charges that the utility in their marketing say, one, there's a group of these that are in our control. That's essentially, they claim that only the distribution energy charge is in their control when they're speaking publicly. I think that's a little disingenuous for them to say that, but they are very adamant. But then there's also what they call public policy decisions. Public policy costs are baked into the delivery side of this. And there's also taxes, and then the cost that they say they have no control over. So the customer charge, this is supposed to be just a flat charge for each customer that is based off of just the cost of being a customer. Billing, back-end system, the overhead, if you will. Now, what is it? Is it $6 on here? Sorry, $6. Should it be $6? Should it be higher? Should it be lower? Those are some interesting policy arguments. For example, there's multiple customer classes. If you are in a different customer class, an industrial customer, or they even have a special customer class for Amtrak for its electric propulsion, their customer charges are way different. It could be hundreds, thousands of dollars per customer in different customer classes. Um, the idea
My
here,
office, it's 10.
there you go. It's $10. And they have shifted this charge around sometimes and tried to delay collection of it for affordability purposes. Often that is just delaying collection of a number that is eventually going to be collected anyway. Um, and the argument for it being higher is like if the cost of me as a customer is not variable, as in it's the same every month, then why are you baking into variable pricing? Like everything else, a whole bunch of these things are volumetric, distribution, renewable energy, energy efficiency programs. Those are based off how much energy I use. If there are fixed costs for me being a customer, shouldn't that be recovered in a fixed cost to the customer rather than a variable cost? This is the argument that the more variable you make it, then you make it harder to electrify because you're charging people a whole lot more money based off the energy that they use versus a fixed cost, which is I'm paying it one way or the other. And if I use more electricity, it doesn't change that cost to me because it doesn't change that cost to the company or to Rhode Island Energy. That's the way it could balance out. Other states have much higher fixed customer charges in order to avoid this particular question. But that ends up being a decision that is generally proposed by a utility and approved by the commission. And the rest of us can say, we don't like the way you do it, but we'd have to prove that our way is better than their judgment. And since it's very subjective about what that customer charge can be, good luck setting it anywhere else besides where the utility wants to set it. And the regulators want to approve it. The rest of us are kind of bystanders on that argument. But there's legitimate policy reasons for it to not be small, but it would be much larger in that way. Okay. The Renewable Energy Growth Program is how much each of us pays into the Renewable Energy Growth Program. This one's pretty straightforward. And if you're not familiar, the Renewable Energy Growth Program is designed for renewable energy developers that want to get a clearing price for all of the energy that they develop. They submit into that program, they get an approved long-term contract, and then everything they generate, they'll get paid for that amount. So it is a set contract rather than net metering, which is a variable amount. So this is our cost for Renewable Energy Growth Program. The LIHEAP enhancement, that's the low income heating. Wait, I forgot all the letters. Low income
Heating assistance program.
Thank you. I knew I had an assist coming from you. So that's once again, that's how much you're paying into the LIHEAP program for that month. The distribution energy charge, this is generally considered what Rhode Island Energy will claim. This is the one that we have control over. And this is how much they are charging us for their distribution system, their poles, their wires, their infrastructure investments. There's a portion of that's going to paying for all of the meters to be installed, new transformers, new substations. That all gets baked into there. Now that number is set through three primary dockets to get that number. One is the distribution rate case. We have a new one starting up. I'm sure most folks have heard about it. But the primary revenue requirement, and I can go into what a revenue requirement is, but the primary amount of money that the utility needs to earn is set in the rate case and then shows up in the distribution energy charge. Now, there's two other factors that primarily go into that. One is every year they have an infrastructure safety and reliability docket, which is where they say, hey, we think that there are some things in order to ensure reliability and safety of the system, we want all the ratepayers to front us money because we're going to go do these things because we don't do them, there's a safety and reliability risk. The idea here is that if we do an annual infrastructure safety and reliability docket, we will front the money for things that we know are needed for these core considerations of safety and reliability. But if they want to improve the system, they can't get money for that here. They wanted to reduce the regulatory lag, the time between when they spend the money and when they get the money back for safety and reliability concerns. I personally think that the transition from PPL or to PPL from National Grid has been a massive rethinking about how the utility uses the ISR docket. PPL sees it as a cash cow, and they have put a whole lot more proposals and infrastructure proposals into the ISR that National Grid historically did not do. Now, the critique there is that you will hear PPL and sometimes a regulator say, well, National Grid wasn't doing enough to maintain safety and reliability. They were just trying to keep this number as low as possible. While Rhode Island Energy seems to be both managing a backlog of that as well as proposing improvements because they want to be the best in class utility, as according to JD Power, in case you wanted me to get my marketing voice on. You know, what I can tell you, like I'm not going to try to say one is right and one is wrong or anything there. I don't think that's the point here. But what I will tell you is that the size of the ISR dockets has grown significantly, more than doubled in size since PPL took over. The downside of that is, sorry, I got kids coming home. They're loud. And the door closed. The downside of using the ISR for this is that it's really fast. Really, really fast. The filings happen in mid-December and they need to be approved by the end of March. And come hell or high water, these hearings shall not be delayed. They must go through. And so the way that they are developed is that there's like 6 months of coordination between the Division of Public Utilities and Carriers and Rhode Island Energy saying, going back and forth of this is what we believe we need, and this is them saying this is what we think that is reasonable based off of the needs that you've presented. They come up with I would say 9 times out of 10, they come up with a joint proposal and they put it in front of the commission and they jointly defend it. And so the division, even if it doesn't entirely agree with all this money going out, by the time it's proposed, they have given up on trying to cut that cost in any way. The commission each year that at least I have been in, and this will be 3 years running of being a party to these dockets, the commission has cut costs every year, primarily because they identified key line items and say, you are trying to improve service. We're not saying you can't improve service. You totally can. By all means, make these investments. We're just not going to give you the money up front. Make the investments, build the thing, prove that it's valuable, then come back to us and ask for the money. That's the regulatory lag that was previously built into the system to encourage utility to make only prudent investments because there's a level of risk that you might never get this money back. If they use the ISR, they have no risk. And that's why they are moving more and more things through the ISR because there's no risk involved with it. And this is my personal opinion, Rhode Island Energy sees this as a benefit and that they want to do more of that and not use the distribution rate cases as often. So that's what. And then the third factor that goes into that distribution energy charge is what's called their annual rate reconciling, their annual retail rate reconciliation that they do. And this is a docket that leads into that has to be decided once again by April of every year, where all of the previous reconciling factors that they have proposed, they go through and say, here's how much money we were authorized to earn or spend. Here's how much money we collected from the customers. We didn't collect enough, so we're going to add another 1/10 of a penny on this charge next year to add more. Or we collected more than we should have, we're going to lower the distribution charge by 1/10 of a penny to account for we overcollected. And these have this annual revisiting of all of the reconciling factors. You add in any new infrastructure safety and reliability factors, plus the base distribution rate. You put that all together, and that is generally how you get your distribution energy charge. I say that broadly, and I go, there are deviations from that. There are ways you go, well, that's not how this works. And there are things that don't work that way. I'm just saying most broadly, that is how that piece of the bill is compiled. The renewable energy distribution charge. Wait, let me make sure I didn't get this one confused. Sorry, they call these things the same name sometimes, and renewable energy cost of program. Oh, so this is mostly the net metering charge. There are some other programs I think that are baked into it, but the renewable energy distribution charge is another way of saying this is how much money you are paying into the net metering program. If I went further down, I imagine I could find some other renewable energy or procurement reconciling factors, but that's the primary scope of this. Yeah, and then the energy efficiency programs is the energy efficiency program. They have a 3-year plan and then annual budgets, and that annual budget gets baked into this, and this is how they recover the cost of those energy efficiency programs. The transmission charge is, I think this is the one that's kind of debatable about whether it's in Rhode Island Energy Control or not. But this is essentially the charge that FERC or ISO New England, the ISO New England sends to them is like, this is your contribution to the transmission, the interstate transmission system. You got to pay for your portion of it. This is the area where I know the least. I have not done a lot of transmission advocacy. We have a whole CLF group of folks that go up to ISO New England and sit on their working group. So if I have questions here, I always call a friend. But I know if Acadia Center were on, this is an area where they've been doing some advocacy around grid enhancing technologies to make sure that our transmission system, if we're paying for it, then it's being built to the most to carry the most energy and using the most current technology rather than just like for like replacements. But in the end, this is the cost. The reason why I don't know, I question whether Rhode Island Energy actually can totally disclaim responsibility for this is, well, I bet you they have regulated and unregulated affiliates that play in the transmission market, where they are also related companies that are building transmission and that they are earning money on doing it. It's not Narragansett Electric, and somebody asked this before. Narragansett Electric is our distribution company, our distribution system in Rhode Island. It is owned by PPL. PPL owns a lot of other companies. Some of those companies are in regulated utility markets, and some of them are unregulated alternative in alternative industries. Could be including like National Grid had a very big renewable energy development team in National Grid Renewables or National Grid Ventures. That was under the National Grid umbrella, but it wasn't regulated as part of our Public Utilities Commission because it wasn't in a regulated business. PPL does the same. And if I would be shocked if we did a full breakdown of who owns all the transmission assets across New England and PJM, the Mid-Atlantic region where they operate, I would be shocked if they didn't own assets in the transmission sector. They would just own it under a different company name with the same owners. All right, and then the one thing that's on here, that there's another line item that's not on here is the transition charge. Transition charge is when we deregulated and told the utilities that they weren't allowed to own generation systems and generation facilities, well, then they had contracts with generators that they had to cancel. And the transition charge is them recovering the cost of any canceled contracts or abandoned stranded assets that they had to release ownership over during that during the deregulation effort. It has bounced between a small number nowadays. It's bounced between a small positive and a small negative number to sometimes they have earned money back from the federal government because the federal government didn't do what it was supposed to do on nuclear waste removal. And so court orders paid our utilities damages. Every dollar that got redirected to Rhode Island ratepayers through that got moved into the storm fund and was not actually refunded back to us, but was used to offset storm recovery costs, storm damage costs. Once again, is that a good idea or a bad idea? I don't know, but I do know that millions of dollars went into that fund rather than going back to ratepayers under the transition charge. And now if you look at your bill, I think it is 1/100th of a penny. Is that what it is? Or 1,000th of a penny, somewhere along there. I pay a penny, I think. If I use 1,000 kilowatts, I'll pay 1 penny of a transition charge today on this bill. And who knows, that'll change again in April. Yeah, Tina.
That transition charge is quite a low amount, and also fairness, I think, is an interesting concept in utility stuff. But I'm curious, is there a reason why the utility didn't eat the cost of the transition? Were they allowed to recoup it? Like, are they allowed to charge or return money to ratepayers, like by contract?
I'm hearing 2 questions in there, so maybe I'm going to try to tackle one first. But why did they get that? It was because when we deregulated, the legal theory behind it was they had paid for things and then we took it from them. You're not allowed to own this anymore. But we signed these contracts. And so if you're going to do it, was essentially a regulatory taking. And so their ownership of those assets were protected by the Fifth Amendment. I think I got the amendments right. And so if we said you're not allowed to own that anymore, but you had owned it in the past, then we took it from you and you are eligible for just compensation for what you have been deprived of. And so that was the utilities theory behind it. And instead of going through a court case on it, essentially that as states deregulated, they came to settlement agreements with the utility to identify this is how much we're going to pay you over what period of time. And then we'll reconcile it over time. So the second question, I wasn't quite sure what you were getting at of like the utility could give us money, but why would they ever give us money? So maybe I'm not understanding what you were asking.
I think I initially misunderstood the way, or like the purpose of the transition. It makes more sense when you had put in that it was the company's like asset, I'm using that word in quotes, asset that they owned that was then taken from them, so they were owed compensation. So
Yeah.
that explains my thinking on the second one. Thank you.
Yeah, and why it went negative is that we had paid them for their lost assets. And essentially they had contracts with like power generators, and then they had paid out money to power generators, and they said you're not allowed to own those facilities, whether you owned them or not. Is the whole. I don't want to relitigate 30 years ago. But then, so we had compensated them, for example, for the power generation contracts they had with It was one of the Yankee nuclear power plants. I don't remember exactly which one off the top of my head. And then when the federal government didn't properly dispose of the nuclear waste, they entered in settlement to pay the generator there. And because they had already been paid by us, they had double recovered. And so that money had to go back to the utilities. So in order to keep those, so that the nuclear plants weren't double recovering that money. And so that's why it went positive for us, is they were repaying us something that we had already paid out. And instead of paying us back directly, they put it into the storm fund so that we didn't have to pay more money into storm costs. We'll see. So that's kind of that network. Okay. That's electric. I made a joke. Nobody gets my jokes. It's a tough crowd, you guys. Tough crowd for a Monday afternoon. Harsh. All right. Gas system. Let me zoom out here. So once again, oversimplified version of what the gas distribution or gas interstate, what is the word I'm looking for? Transmission pipelines and distribution system here. And everybody asks this whenever I use this one, what's NGL stream here? This is non-gas liquids here. So like in the gas processing, there is things that are generated or created in the processing, and then those are sent out into other industries. For example, plastics. The NGL stream here is what fuels the plastics industry, just as a solid example. But the way this works, you have gas production, the pipelines, processing, feeder lines, interstate transmission, city gates, distribution system. So the Algonquin transmission pipeline, for example, the one that runs through Burrillville, or the Constitution pipeline that's getting all the attention these days, that's all here on the transmission pipeline side of it. This is how we get gas from one part of the country to another part of the country. The city gate, and it's not like a Brandenburg gate, but it's that point of connection between the transmission system and the distribution system. So at that point, that's when the movement of the thing of value, gas, goes from transmission ownership to distribution ownership. Not ownership, but at least management of it. And the distribution pipelines is what we see throughout all of our distribution utility, and then it connects to our homes and businesses through that residential and commercial connections. So one thing I'll say about the gas system versus the electric system is that in the gas system, we are moving and tracking legitimate, not BTUs, what is that measure? CCM, cubic centimeter, cubic meters of gas. We're moving a physical product from point A to point B. And so our market system for billing for this is a lot more logical, because in the electric system, we're not moving, like in the transmission system and everything, we're not really moving an electron from a power generator 300 miles away and tracking it all the way through to my home. It doesn't work that way. But when it comes to gas, it works a lot closer to that. Is that when you buy a unit of gas, well, a unit of gas is a unit of gas. When you buy a unit of energy or a unit of electricity, who knows what set of electrons are going to make up that kilowatt hour. So there's a lot more close tracking on the gas distribution system. year. And so for that reason, our gas bills are generally a lot more simple for that reason. So this is my most recent gas bill, actually. So this is a little bit more up to date. I kind of pulled this in. Same thing, they do supply and delivery breakdown. And if I go to the next page, it works very much the same way. What are the therms billed? Like this is the units. They meter the CCS. They have this factor. I won't go into the math behind this. I was curious one day and I did track it down of like, why don't they measure us by CCFs or what have you? But anyway, they have the monthly usage that you have. They multiply it by how much you get charged. So the cost of gas and what is the per unit price, and then I get my supply system, my supply. And then on the distribution side of it, they have the same thing. They have a customer charge of $14, low income heating assistance program, energy assistance program, distribution adjustment charge, the off-peak distribution charge, and then the energy efficiency program. And to this day, I couldn't tell you without going back and looking it up what the difference between the distribution adjustment charges and the off-peak distribution charge. I can never keep these two things straight. If anybody else knows what they are, please jump in here because I'll have to pull up a bill or Google it. But either way, one of them is about the distribution system and one of them is more about the transmission system, and I can't remember which one's which. But overall, that is how we pay for the transmission of a unit of gas from the into the interstate transmission system and into the local distribution system. So there you go. That's our gas bill. There's a lot less to it. And I'll also say in many ways, it's a lot less regulated. There's a lot more that happens on the gas side than the electric side that way. Cool. Start at the beginning. Okay. I'm going to stop the share here, and then I was going to do a moment on the PUC and the DPUC and their differing responsibilities. And then I can go into how utilities get paid, or the other thing that I was kind of prepared for. So, but first off, were there other questions that anybody wanted to tackle before I try to do at least one more thing tonight? Nope. All right. All right. I don't have a good slide. Sorry, what was that?
I was just going to ask if the slides are going to be available somewhere.
Sure, I can send those around. There's a lot more in those slides because I did it for a different presentation, but I will happily send it off to Jeff and you can circulate as you see fit. Let me.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Just want to give you a heads up when it's labeled something totally different. You go, what is this? I just used it for a presentation on Thursday. All right, so the PUC and the DPUC are sister regulatory agencies. And Seth, at any point in this, if you want to jump in and be like, I have a slightly different interpretation of this, by all means, please do so.
I'm glad to listen.
All right, so our PUC and DPUC, I will first off, I'm going to stand on my soapbox for just one moment on this. In Rhode Island, these are two different agencies. Most places in the country, they are not. They are one agency that works in a unified fashion. I've done a little tracking down about why do we have two agencies in Rhode Island that seem to be can be accomplished by a single agency in other states. And surprise, surprise, it was a disagreement between two political officials about 20 years ago that couldn't agree on things and wanted to punish each other. One of them was a Carullo, just saying that. It always comes back to a Carullo somewhere. But the idea here is that the Division of Public Utilities and Carriers is the general regulator. They are supposed to be the interface with the utility, telling them what you're supposed to be doing and evaluating whether what you are doing meets legal requirements. The Public Utilities Commission is the one that's supposed to set the rates. And so this was the divide, is that they took out of the division the rate setting authority. The General Assembly did at one point, took the rate setting authority out of the division and gave it its own independent agency. But it's not actually independent because it shares a budget with the division. So if you don't have free access to money, are you truly independent? I raise that question, but I do not answer that question. It's a point of interesting position. So in the traditional situation of a case in front of the Public Utilities Commission where, say, rates are being set, whether the utility is going to get compensated for its infrastructure, safety, and reliability proposal. What you end up having is the division sits as a party in that case, and they can they don't even have to intervene. They are a party to any case in front of the Public Utilities Commission by right. They often see their viewpoint as they have a couple, I would argue, conflicting mandates. One is they're supposed to be the general ratepayer advocate. They're supposed to be the advocate for all of us and the rates and saying, is this just and reasonable? Are we being charged an appropriate amount? And they're supposed to represent us in that case. In any case. You're on mute there, Jeff.
That's the division.
Yeah.
It's supposed to represent the ratepayer in front of the commission.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yet, they also have an obligation that they have to provide for the financial viability of the company, of Rhode Island Energy. And so they are constantly in this position of supposedly balancing the needs of ratepayers to be only charged just and reasonable rates with the needs of Rhode Island Energy to make sure that they have they are financially viable. And there's a whole Supreme Court case that goes into that, and that what that means and how the division is supposed to be, or what that standard is supposed to be. And then the division is constantly interpreting it. So you're in this position sometimes, the division saying, well, the utility needs that money to stay competitive, but ratepayers can't afford it. So what do? I generally say a bad job is what they do. And I have no further insight into it because you can't resolve this inherent conflict. And they don't have an office of, like, if you went over to Massachusetts or in Connecticut, they have an office of consumer counsel. That is the ratepayer advocate. And they also have a regulatory department. And so it's like you split up the duties so this one entity isn't trying to do it all. And I often think as that I feel like our regulator, our division, puts a little more emphasis on the need for financial viability of the company than on keeping rates just and reasonable for customers. And a cynic in me says, well, they're probably auditioning for jobs over there and they want to have a good saying for it. But that's just my cynical side saying that. So that's one side. And then the Public Utilities Commission, their job is to be the ones to actually vet and approve rates themselves. So are they charging us 17 cents? Well, the PUC has to approve the 17 cents charge by making the specific findings of, like, this is the legal standard to allow this charge. We vetted it, the facts match it, and we find that that is the just and reasonable rate. And that is the position that they're constantly finding themselves in. And so that's the divide, the primary divide between the two. And it goes down the line. This is not just on electric utilities or gas utilities. This is how they deal with ferries. This is how they deal with taxi cabs. This is how they deal with telecommunications side of it. Like this, they regulate all of utilities. Oh, water utilities, that's in there too. I think I saw Greg put that comment up. That's all in there. And they have this similar situation between the two. One is the rate setter and one is the regulator, which is why if I have a complaint about Rhode Island Energy, I don't call the commission, I call the division. They have consumer complaint department. If I want an investigation into it, I call the division. That being said, there are times when the commission says the division's not properly investigating it, we're going to do it ourselves. And so what we also have is a interminable pissing match between the two agencies. And it is constantly reflective of whether the administrator of one and the chairperson of the other are on speaking terms or not. Can they get along? Can they communicate effectively? Or are they constantly stepping on each other's toes and pointing fingers and saying, you're doing something you shouldn't be doing? Well, I'm doing it because you're not doing it. And once again, if you have no gubernatorial leadership to keep their agencies in line, this often spills out into the public in various unexpected ways. And I would say right now, we have to be in a moment where the commission and the division are not working hand in glove, as the case may be, and find themselves consistently trampling on each other's turf as they will. So I don't know. Well, I would just call it generally dysfunctional in a lot of ways, and doesn't necessarily lead to effective decision making. That being said, it's what we've got. And I might want something different. And I have talked with everybody involved in this and be like, hey, so what about combining the agencies again? I think we're past the point where it doesn't make sense anymore. Let's combine them and have departments. you have your commission, you have your consumer counsel, you have your customer complaint department. Do it all under one umbrella and stop the interagency fighting in that way. So I don't know if we'll ever get to do that, but I always put it out there. So that's the biggest divide between the two, the division and the Public Utilities Commission and the Division of Public Utilities and Carriers. Rate setter, regulator, at its heart. Okay. I see we've lost some folks. I can go on. I have a couple slides here prepped for understanding how the utility gets paid and compensated, but I can also hold off and do that another time if we would prefer.
So, well, let me ask you. So were you going to talk more about the PUC eventually, or?
Yes, and you'll see in the slides I send around is like there's a list of dockets and things that are up in front of the commission where different decisions are being made. In the I use the framing in context of a moving forward. How do we have more how do we achieve a more energy democracy? Was the framing we used, and that is like how do we get citizens' participation? Where can it be most effective and most influential? And so I have some slides on that. But usually I do this level setting so we know why some of those dockets make sense and some of them don't. And also my interminable frustration that we are constantly moving people into public hearing scenarios where their input means nothing, absolutely nothing. And yet we keep doing this dog and pony show and are surprised when people get really upset when their feedback has no influence on the outcome of decisions. So I can go either pathway. If you want to do more about, well, what are some opportunities for intervention, or at least engagement, I can do that as well, if you prefer.
Given the group here, I wonder if, I don't know what other people think, but maybe going there.
I would encourage you to talk about how the utility gets paid in the context of the utility business model conversation that we're about here.
Okay, let's do that.
All right, I'll move that over.
Jamie, eventually, I think we all probably would like to hear your position on what actually needs to be reformed when it comes to the utility process. But that's going beyond what we can do today, of course. But I think for another
maybe
time.
we can get you back.
Yes, you can get me back. This is easy to do. I prefer doing this and talking to my children. So this is easy after school.
Okay. So we don't have to cover everything today.
We absolutely don't. And so what I'm going to do here, so what I'm sharing, this is actually a walkthrough. So for those of you that know Beth Cotter, Representative Beth Cotter, she had a proposal this last legislative session to cap the utility profit margin at, I think she said 4%. And I said, hey, Beth, that's a really interesting proposal. How much are you aware of how the utility actually earns its money? And she goes, I don't actually know that much. I go, let's come in and talk about it so you can be a better advocate for that. I'm not saying whether I agree with your position or not, but if you're going to advocate for that, I think you should know the context in which you're playing here. And it was a fantastic conversation. And I ended up joining a community meeting that she had with her constituents to talk about utility costs. But what I had to do, and this is the endeavor that we are about to embark upon again with the upcoming rate case, is this question of how do utilities get paid and what does it work? How does it work? Because what they're about to do is they're going to come in and ask for a huge, huge, huge new amount of money. I don't know how much it's going to be, but I think it's going to make us go googly-eyed to a certain degree. You're like, you guys want how much more money? That seems like a lot. I don't think you're reading the room. When everybody's talking about affordability, you're doing something totally different. But there is a reason why they're going to come up with that number. And it is in this real basic, what is the word here? The equation. Get all the best words today. It comes into this equation right here at the top, the revenue requirement. So I tried my best here to define what these terms mean. So the revenue requirement essentially is how much money does a utility need to receive every year in order to operate? Now, operate means return, like they get their payback, they get their profit, Their safety and reliability are maintained. When I turn my lights on, the lights turn on. When I turn on my gas boiler furnace, I get heat. How do I make sure that we get all of these things? And the revenue requirement is supposed to be the articulation by the utility of how much money they need each year to deliver on what they're responsible for delivering. Okay, seems logical. How do you calculate this? Well, you have a rate of return, you multiply it by a rate base, and you add to it your operating expenses. All right, so what are all those things? Well, the rate of return, this is their approved return on equity plus the cost of servicing their debt. The idea here being is that the rate of return, that when they go out when they choose to build something, say they want to build a $5 million substation, they got two ways of financing it. They can give out equity and get capital back in exchange for equity, or they can take out debt. These would be the two primary ways to do it. In this model, they kind of say we're putting these on equal terms. So there are a return on equity and the cost of debt are combined into what is our rate of return. So you multiply that by the rate base. The rate base, and I did this here, there a lot of things. I can show you a spreadsheet of it. It's a pretty small type spreadsheet, but in the end, what it is like the amount of stuff that is being used and is useful, also known as plant and service, plus the value of the maintaining the property that they owned, plus their working capital costs, which means they deploy capital to accomplish something. They get a working cost of capital back. This is not return on equity, but for example, for the storm fund, right now we're in debt to the storm fund, some $15 million, I think. Well, that's money that the utility has spent to recover from storm costs that they have never got the money back. In other words, they have deployed $15 million of capital to solve this problem. And what they're going to get back is both the capital back as well the working cost of capital back. So that is whatever the value of that capital is in the marketplace, they get a return on that. It's interest in another name, if you will. So that's their working capital. How much capital have they deployed to solve problems on behalf of customers where they get a return on that working cost of capital, plus any debt that they haven't amortized. So debt they've got amortized goes into the cost of debt, but like revolving funds or unamortized debt gets added into the rate base here. They subtract out of that any income tax deferences that they have. They've either paid in advance or they have refunds coming, plus any customer deposits they already have on hand that are going to go to meeting some of these costs here. You bundle that all together, you add it all up, you sprinkle a little lack of transparency and a nice dose of opaqueness and a whole lot of acronyms that nobody knows what they mean, and you get a rate base. Excuse me. So on that rate base what they get in that rate base is they get a percentage of everything on that rate base they earn a return on. That's the return on equity. Or that's the rate of return. So the rate of return, sorry, because I realized the return on equity and cost of debt are both multiplied by the rate base to get a number. And then you add to that all of their annual operating expenses. This is overhead. This is the billing department. This is HR. This is their audits. This is all of their O&M expenses. They don't earn a return on equity, but they get all of those costs back. So whatever those costs are, as long as they've been approved, there they go. So you add all that together, and that's how you get a revenue requirement. That number is set only in the distribution rate cases. So the last time it was set was 2018. The next time it's going to be set is in 2026. So that number doesn't change, except in all the ways that it does change because of the ISR, because of these reconciling factors, so on and so forth. But also the rate base changes every year. Because as they put more things into service, they get to earn a return on equity on those things that they put in service over the course of the year. So in other words, every year this has to be recalculated and revisited as part of as part of the reconciling factors. They get vetted on how much did you put in service this year. Okay, and so the number of their return on equity, what they're authorized for, and what they actually earn every year are two different numbers. For that reason, both because the revenue requirement doesn't change although the rate base changes. And so if your operating expenses change, your rate base changes, but your rate of return doesn't change, it is up to an equation where the revenue requirement, I'm sorry, I did that backwards. But anyway, this is suffice to say, some of these variables change every year. And so what that ends up being is that their allowed rate of return, their actual rate of return end up being different for it. Yeah, Jeff.
So the plant in service. So if they build a big transmission line, that adds to the plant in service.
Well, not a transmission line because that's on the other side of the.
Oh, okay.
That's the other side. But like a pole outside.
A pole. Okay.
You know,
a substation. Is that
a substation? Yeah.
okay? And then does that get depreciated over time on a set schedule?
Yeah, and every asset class they have has a different depreciation schedule. So they've got hard assets, they've got software assets, it goes down the line, and they have different depreciation schedules for each one, which is also why their rate of return changes each year, because they're devalue it maybe 8% this year versus last year. And so the rate base diminishes by that depreciation amount. So they earn less money off of the same thing. But if they replace the pole in front of my house, you just reset the depreciation schedule. So if it was not fully depreciated before, they get the full value back, even if it hasn't been depreciated. And if they build the new pole, they get the full value of the undepreciated pole to begin with.
So why do they sometimes, it seems like they charge the customer for the pole or
See, I was talking about pole
solar
replacements, for example.
What's that?
I was talking about pole replacements. But if you are asking for new service, then the customers get charged to run a new line to your home. So if they have to build, you're building out on a new development, they have to run 3 new poles on that line, you're going to get charged the whole thing. Which is oddly different than the gas side, where the cost of that hookup is borne by all customers.
Right.
While on the electric side, it's not. Not that I'm flagging something that needs to be changed, but that's something that needs to be changed.
So, yeah, we had a member lived in Little Compton, wanted to put solar on our house, did put solar on our house. And I think it was a ton of money. And it was also going to mean that her neighbors down the street, if they put on solar panels, they wouldn't have to pay anything because she paid for the infrastructure.
Justice.
Yeah. Okay.
Let there be justice one day. Let this system make sense one day. All right. So, okay. Return on equity. I'm just going to jump down here just a little bit to the rest of these notes. So now the way I think Seth and I probably agree on this, and we'll see what happens in the rate case. But right now, the return on equity numbers, the way that they're being set defies logic, honestly. That if you said, hey, you know what a company should earn, a return that you would expect, and this is the way it was defined in the Supreme Court case that sets forth how utilities have to be compensated. What would a shareholder expect to return on a similar investment with a similar level of risk? So the PUC is directed to authorize a return on equity for a utility company that would compensate a shareholder for making a similar investment with a similar level of risk. Now, the interesting thing is, what level of risk is there to a shareholder on a utility company? 0.
Right.
So how does this equation work? If there's actually no risk, then how can you have such a high, should there be a rate of return on a 0 risk investment? If you went to a bank and said, I would like $5 now, there's no risk, I'm gonna give you $5 back tomorrow, there's no interest. Well, there is interest because that's what the rent-seeking effort here is. And we're in that same game here. And the idea behind the way that they frame this is, if I have $1 million that I want to invest in the market, I should need to be able to, if I am evaluating investing in utility companies, the Rhode Island Energy should look just as profitable for that investment as another utility. And that's the way that they define a similar risk. The similar risk is not there's 0 risk in a utility investment. It is, what's the risk of the money going to a utility not Rhode Island Energy rather than coming to Rhode Island Energy? So what it's become is a game of who has the highest rate of return, and everybody else needs to catch up to it. As opposed to saying, what is the value of this capital that you're deploying, and what is a reasonable interest rate for that? And I think ILSR, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, did a whole paper on what is the appropriate what is the actual working cost of capital. Or it was another allied organization.
Regulatory Assistance Project.
There it was RAP. Yeah, they did it. And you look at it and they come up with numbers that are more like 4.5%. Because if you put that money into the market and you're in 4.5%, that's what it is. I mean, that's cognizant of the risk of it.
Can I just speak up for 1 second on
Please
this?
do.
So this is a real utility business model issue, obviously, but because it also indicates the problem with the regulation of the utility, and just for a very fundamental thing, this is a regulated monopoly. They were given a charter in Rhode Island to operate our energy systems for the public interest. And if they're not regulated to do so, they will take whatever they can get. You hardly blame them. They're basically in business for their shareholders, and they will represent the public interest to the extent that they're required to. But the fact that this return on equity issue has been so mismanaged indicates a problem on the regulatory side. I totally agree with Jamie and the Regulatory Assistance Project that this is way out of whack, and it's driving a lot of cost to ratepayers, which they're supposed to be regulating very carefully. And it's really odd that it can be so obviously out of whack and not be corrected, as far as I can tell. And I guess the other example of this, I want to go back to something that a couple of things Jamie talked about. I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. One is this idea of the transition charge being uncovered, basically value of assets that the utility claimed they needed to be reimbursed for. And there's this total gray area about, first of all, Jamie talked about some investments are paid in advance, and those that aren't paid in advance are depreciated, and they're recovering them in rates. So there's this question of how do you define what the utility really, quote unquote, owns at any time in that process and should be paid back for. On the other hand, with regard to the transition charge, it's an opportunity to look at the future because they're always talking about stranded assets being a problem with changing the way they manage their gas system, for instance. And you could use the same model of a transition charge as long as they're not being overpaid for the assets. If there is outstanding value in the assets, which is a big if in my mind, how that's calculated is a big question. But they could use the same system for recovering those costs, certainly, and it shouldn't be a deterrent to reform. But just one other quick thing. Jamie talked about the fact that the ISR cases are typically settled between the division and the utility and presented as a joint filing. The rate cases are often settled between the division and the utility, and they're presented as a kind of accepted, like the last rate case, the other people that were interveners, including a group that I represented, are told to either accept it or litigate the case on your own, basically. And
Yeah.
so it's
Like a
just,
pound
it's
sand.
so indicative of the problem with the regulatory system. It's like it's a deal that they make in a back room and they come to you with it and they say kind of take it or leave it. It's not regulation for the benefit of the ratepayer or to ensure that the service of the public interest. I don't think. I think there's so many different examples of that. And that's something that really goes to the heart of utility business model reform. We need to be much better able to control these results and ensure that we have regulators that are doing their job of protecting the public interest and actually servicing the ratepayers' interest in this context. So
Ditto. Totally agree. The hard part I find is like, okay, so how do we get at that both the regulatory model and a business model? And as going in a little bit further here is like the different pathways that have been tried have not been successful. up to this point. And I'll give credit to our friends in our advocacy community. It's not for a lack of trying, but we have not been successful at turning this on its head in any way or significantly changing it. And this authorized art, just to do like a little exercise on this return on equity of like what's currently in existence right now. Right now, Rhode Island Energy is authorized. They can earn up to 9.275% on all of their rate base. So everything I have here, like this is what they're authorized to earn. But there's always some wiggle room here. So if they earn more, they actually generate more revenue, then there's a sharing of that revenue over a certain amount. And the more revenue they bring, this is the idea of like you're capped at this, but it's a squishy cap. And so if you happen to go above it and the way that you would go above it is not by collecting more money. It's usually by depressing costs in some way. Because the revenue requirement is set. They don't get to earn more money than that, except for, once again, all the ways in which they do get to earn more money than that. But they're not, in general, like they don't earn more money. The revenue requirement doesn't get reset. So the idea is like they got savings. They're able to earn a higher return on equity because they reduced their operating costs, mostly on what do they call it? What do I call it? The operating expenses. And so there's these levels here that if it went up by 1 percentage point, well, then every dollar above that is split 50-50 between the utility and the customer. So 50%, 50 cents of it is sent back to the customers, 50 cents of it is given to the company. So their cap on return on equity already includes another 1% soft cap. And then above that, if you go up to everything over that secondary soft cap, 75% of it goes back to ratepayers and 25% of it goes to the company. The theory, I'll give the theory first, was that if you can reduce operating costs, then you're reducing costs for everybody. You should earn an incentive for that. This is the basic performance-based regulations. Sure, in concept, in theory, that's the way that it's supposed to operate. So I did a quick pull together. Some other rate cases just resolved right now, so these numbers would need to be updated, but in 2023, the National Grid of Massachusetts requested a 10.5. They got 9.35. Last year, one of them I think Eversource in Connecticut asked for 10.7, got approved at 10.5, or no, they asked for 10.5, they got approved at 9.7, and then the PURA, the utility regulator in Connecticut, dinged them 4 basis points. They said, well, that's what you've earned. Like you earned that, but your operations in the past years have been so terrible, we're knocking it down. You didn't meet existing acceptable standards in your customer service, I think it was, or their delivery. And so we're going to knock your 4 basis points off of what you actually have earned. And this is the idea of like, those are the ways in which performance-based regulation are supposed to work or could work by giving them an increase in value if they achieve certain efficiencies, and that they lose money if they're not delivering mandatory or basic level of service.
Was that a ton of money?
No.
So losing 4% on all
4
their...
basis points. So it's not even 4%, it was 0.04%.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah,
Yeah.
The 2024 numbers might actually be available, but when I did this back in April, they weren't, and I have not updated it. But in 2023, the return on equity of Rhode Island Energy was 4%. That's what they actually earned in 2023. Why did they not get the 9.275% that they were authorized? Why did they only get 4? Well, the distribution rate that was set was done in 2018. A lot of things happened in the market between 2018 and now that has led them to not earning as much money. Primarily, the cost of labor, the cost of operations, and the cost of materials all increased. But they weren't allowed to come in and say, look at all these increases, you have to increase our revenue requirement. They weren't allowed to do that because when PPL bought the utility, they settled with the Attorney General and said, we will sit out for 3 years. If the Attorney General didn't have that settlement, they would have been back in a rate case long ago by now. They also said that you can't come in for a new rate case until you are 100% off all National Grid systems for 1 year. So you have to do a minimum 3 and you have to have at least 1 year where you're on your own system. The 1 year where they're wholly independent of National Grid, they've fully transitioned off of their back-end system. That year ended, I believe, in September. So this September, they were in 1 year of full operations. The last thing they did was the billing system. They really screwed it up. In case you haven't heard, yeah, they did not transition the billing system effectively, and there is an investigation into the utilities operations on that, which might have been filed sometime in the last week, the report of the independent auditor, but I have not reviewed it or pulled it up myself. So this is why so they've been authorized 9.275%. They've been earning anywhere between 4 and 5% for most of the last few years, which is exactly why when they come in for the rate case this year, the number is going to be a little mind-boggling because they're going to they are going to project a revenue requirement that matches this return rate structure that gets them that return on equity that they need. So increasing the cost of their units of labor, increasing the cost of units of whatever their widgets are that they have. All of that's going to go up in their operations, and they're going to put a test year on that shows that their rate case, their revenue requirement is probably going up by 25%, 30%, 35%. We'll see when the rate case is filed.
And
Can I
so
just
the
make
pe-
a quick comment, Jamie?
Yeah.
I mean, you can feel in your bones why this utility business model is so such an anathema to distributed energy future, because anything that actually saves money or creates more efficiency on the system is detrimental to their income, basically. And so there's this crazy dynamic where, you know, they're supposed to be regulated for the benefit of ratepayers, but what really is driving their revenue is cost to ratepayers. They want as much cost on the system as possible. So we talk a lot about system efficiency,
Mm-hmm.
but none of this is set up to provide for it, really. And unless they're regulated very stringently, they're going to be wanting to drive the system cost up so that they can recover more on it. And that's a challenge. That's the challenge for utility business model reform, I think.
And it's also why when you hear Rhode Island Energy saying, hey, these public policy mandates are the problem, like these other pointing to these other things, they're not looking at this because they want a more affordable bill for us. Like, let's not be confused. They see each of those as headroom on the bill. If I remove energy efficiency costs from the bill, I can fill it with infrastructure costs that we earn revenue on. And look, they're not shy about that. If you get them in, they will not say it to the commission directly, but if you talk to their legislative staff, you talk to their planning staff, this is exactly how they see it.
But
I
it's
do
also
not come out
classic.
blind
It's
on it.
also classic myth making. I mean, they're doing just what everyone else is doing in creating myth. Basically, they're putting the costs of the system on those things that actually have the greatest potential to save costs on the system. They're saying that these renewable energy solutions are actually costing people when they have the promise of saving in the long term. They're a short-term charge, and they accentuate the short-term charge element without giving credit to the long-term benefits, the cost effectiveness over time. But because they are desperate to avoid reduced system costs, they don't want reduced system costs because they'll get reduced revenue fundamentally.
Yeah. Yeah, Jeff.
So I'm just wondering, are there things that we want them to do so the gets stuff, getting them to upgrade their transmission lines. Would that be, would they get a return on that?
Not transmission. They don't. I mean,
Right.
they have affiliated entities that
So
benefit from transmission, but they
that's
won't
transmission, not
admit that it
distribution.
benefits their distribution company, is my guess.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the transmission side is it's so hard because it's also the transmission system sits in a regulatory vacuum. The PUC does not have jurisdiction over interstate transmission. But does FERC really?
Except to the extent that they're putting transmission charge on distributed generation, which they are doing. They don't,
Yeah,
they don't have, they arguably don't have the jurisdiction to do that, but they are doing that.
but they are doing it. Yeah, and the whole the reason why we've seen some interest in the GETS legislation is that it starts creeping for better, is both for better or for worse, but creeping PUC, attempting to creep PUC jurisdiction over parts of that system that are otherwise not actually being regulated by any interstate regulatory federal agency. And so that's how we get to the hard part is like, technically the PUC isn't supposed to do anything that is happening in another state. And this is an interstate transmission of energy. And that's supposed to land on FERC, but FERC doesn't actually regulate the construction standards or the operational standards of the transmission lines. So who does? Yeah, Kevin.
So, of course, they're going to want to invest more money in the system because that's how they make money. But when you do a big project, there are basically two ways of financing it. You can pay for it out of equity or you can borrow against it. What's the typical ratio between equity and debt on new projects undertaken by RIE?
That's a moving target, but I know I've had some of those conversations. I'm just pulling up their most recent earnings report that I was just looking at before. Let's see. They have about 2 million, 1.2 billion. So I'm looking at what year is that? Sorry, that's December. Oh, how about I use their 5-quarter average? So for example, their rate base and their 5-quarter average ending December of last year has their entire rate base at about 1.2 billion. And of that, if you look at where's the contribution and aid, property held for use? I'm looking for their debt line, cash working capital. You get to about 1.9, get about, no, that number doesn't work. Anyway, I guess I could forward you the spreadsheet and we could kind of suss it out, but I think it's a moving number, and more often it's probably like 60-40 equity to debt, but at times it's 60-40 debt to equity, depending on, like, that is a general range that they have talked about. I personally can't tell you for sure why they choose one or why they choose another in any given moment. And their decisions about whether they use equity or debt is non-reviewable. It is 100% a business decision that can't be called into question.
Really interesting.
Yeah, I'm starting to learn the lines of what the regulators are allowed to do. Like there is a limit to their regulatory authority over the company, and whether they choose debt or equity is one of those key business decisions that leads to the executives.
Interesting, because of course the cost of debt is substantially less than 10%.
Yeah. Yes, it is. So why don't they do more debt financing?
Exactly, or phrased a different way, how could we kind of force them into living with more debt financing?
Well, before I go to Jeff, I'm going to tell you the crazy answer to that question. You get rid of investor-owned utilities, and it's a municipal-owned utility, in which case it's always debt financing because there's no equity to sell.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is why isn't the comparison, what is the value of your debt, or what is the value, your return on equity in comparison to the debt market? Shouldn't that be the comparison versus other states' return on equity? But you can see why Seth's concern about this is like the regulation of this isn't necessarily matching the outcomes that we want to have in it. Yeah, Jeff.
Again, maybe a basic question. does the utility not generate electricity?
No. Well,
So
they
it couldn't,
don't, except for the places where they do.
so could it build a utility scale solar plant and get return on equity on that?
No.
Return on investment?
No,
No.
and that's the product of the deregulation was where we forced our utility to divest from generation assets. And that's what the transition charge is, all paying them back for their investments in generation assets that we
Yeah.
then pass a law saying you are not allowed to own generation. And the reason I say, except for where they do, is they are probably the largest owner of battery storage in Rhode Island. Is that
Oh,
generation or isn't it? Well, I find that to be a Rorschach test, and our regulators have answered it differently in different venues. In front of the EFSB, they regulate it as generation, as saying we have a say over where generation is placed over a certain size, and the EFSB retains that over the siting of batteries. But on the PUC side, they are not prohibited from owning batteries as a generation unit.
well,
So
that's good.
it is whatever you want it to be. And I have raised this with Ron, and I go, I can't make logic out of this. The best answer I got was we made the decisions we had to make in order to achieve the regulatory environment we wanted, not because they are somehow logical and consistent.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
National Grid Ventures took an interest in the offshore wind project as well, and Eversource has interests in, and sometimes they do so in either through affiliates, which is very sketchy in my view, or they do so in different jurisdictions than where they supply electricity. So it's not as clear as it you might think it should be.
That's a really good point about the owning it is like you will find investors in offshore wind where they don't deliver the energy.
Which, I mean, we're all for offshore wind, obviously, but if you have a utility taking a major financial interest in a generation asset, it creates a whole different dynamic, and they may be much more interested in discouraging distributed energy if they have an interest in utility scale energy projects. So it
Because
could
yeah,
create an even worse dynamic
and
than already exists.
this is one of those, offshore wind is not an unadulterated good. It's like there in these systems, like there are these little hidden things. And that a utility scale offshore wind is just replacing the old model with you take out the coal plant, you put a wind power in, but the value streams are very much what the utilities are used to and enjoy.
But
Um,
it also speaks to why utility business model reform is so important across the whole system, basically. It's something that can be good for everything involved, and it's a very systemic focus, which can be advantageous for this movement, I think, because it can create a different dynamic in terms of really focusing in on things like economics that can really move mountains, I think, when you focus on them. So.
and
so
I think one of our biggest struggles is that to change that regulatory or that business model requires legislative intervention. It's not going to happen just through our regulators unless we elect a governor who has a different brain capacity than what we are currently seeing in this space. And the hard part about working with legislators on this is like if you want something that they don't understand, talk micro and macro scale energy economics. How can we get coherent energy policy out of a legislature that I had to go to the sponsor who proposed a 4% return on equity. Like, do you know what you just proposed? And the answer was clearly no. I don't know what I proposed. And this is once again, this is not a critique or like a ding against the representative for doing it. She saw a problem, she reached for solutions, and there was one on the table. Uh, but it's like there was a level of you need to know the rest of this. If you're going to change this number, you got to know where the number sits.
But that is also a good argument. I mean, yes, this is a lot of this stuff is somewhat complex, but that doesn't mean it couldn't be simplified to an extent that people could understand it. And if people like us don't come to an understanding of it, we can't expect other people that are very busy too either. We need to be able to speak the language so that we can, as a group, I think, and we can have advocacy around something that can convince people.